Hello and welcome back to my channel. Jacob Payton here, and I'm going to be talking about Quag Keep by Andre Norton. Andre Norton was the pseudonym for Alice Norton, who was a very prolific science fiction and fantasy author way back when. And I absolutely enjoyed this book. Here is a cool look at the cover. Quag Keep does take place in the very early Dungeons & Dragons universe, think first edition. She actually got the idea of writing this book after playing a Dungeons & Dragons game, which is purported was run by Gary Gygax himself. So I think that's very interesting, especially when you take the time to consider the fact that Gary Gygax was a huge fan of fantasy and science fiction himself. I mean, obviously he created Dungeons & Dragons, but you know, I've read some stuff about him, and there is the whole Appendix N where he pulled a lot of the early Dungeons & Dragons stuff from pulp novels, and he was also a novelist himself. He wrote the Gord series and I think a bunch of other tie-in novels. Obviously Greyhawk was his baby, and that's something I want to talk about too at some point. But today we're talking about Quag Keep. I'm not gonna lie, I actually picked up a copy of this book, or take that back, I found it, but I was looking for a copy of this book for a little while because I got into lit RPGs. Has it been that long? Probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was like, why does this genre feel so new, but at the same time feel very familiar? And I realized that I had read books previously that kind of felt very lit RPG, and then also kind of discovered kind of like the isekai stuff, which is all about people being trapped in video game worlds and anime and manga. I was someone that grew up with Dot Hack. I also read a lot of Hack Slash, but that is a comic book and is very different than Doc Hack, which is about people trapped in an MMO, and it used to come on very, 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 very late at night on Adult Swim. Way back when, and if I do the math on that, it's gonna make me very, very, very sad. And when looking for the roots of the Western lit RPG genre, Quag Keep comes up a lot, because while it's not about a video game, it is about people being stuck in the Dungeons & Dragons universe, or being transported to the Dungeons & Dragons universe, very similar to the book Guardians of the Flame, which I think came out after this one. I feel like this was the first book, and then Guardians of the Flame came out after that, which is also very similar. Larry Niven wrote a book called Dream Park, which is honestly a little more Westworldy. I've started that book. I have not finished it. I've had it on the shelf for years. But also very similar of people being put in a fantasy type situation from the real world. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I can't think of a worse world to be trapped in than like the OSR versions of Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games in general. They were notoriously hard and very crunchy, and that does kind of come through in this. Yeah, I enjoy the Dungeons & Dragons alternate world stuff. There are some modern authors that are doing it as well. Obviously lit RPG is more prevalent. It is kind of interesting when you look at the very clear differences in those two things. One thing I've noticed about reading Andre Norton's book, and actually another book that I started along the very same theme, which I think was called Roll for Initiative, was the fact that one of the big differences between the lit RPG genre, and I don't know what you would really call this, I mean, it's obviously not lit RPG, but of people, I guess, being trapped in tabletop worlds, is it very much seems one of the key differences is the fact that the people trapped in video games know they're trapped in video games, whereas these people in Andre Norton's book don't really know they're trapped in a game. They very much take on the identities of the characters they were playing. And that happened in the other series I was talking about too, which is a more modern series. And when I say more modern, I mean, I think it came out in the last like 2 years. Obviously, it wouldn't count if they didn't figure it out at some point. But I'm trying to think if there's been any other books that I know about that are straight up Dungeons and Dragons tie-ins. And there is not. If there is, I will link them somewhere. But other than that, I know of Quag Keep. There was also a sequel. I'm not sure if Andre Norton wrote it herself or if it was based on notes and came out after her death, because I do believe there was a co-writer attached to it. I am going to try to pick up that at some point so I can read it as well. And now let's dive into Quag Keep. And on the back it says, 6 companions travel under a wizard's geas to encounter and destroy unknown evil. Descriptive delineation, action, and special powers hold the identifying reader in the company of Elf Ingrig, Bard Wymark, Cleric Di Dean, Swordsman Milo Yagin, Lizardman Gulf, Pseudo-Dragon Afrita, Berserker Nail Fangtooth, and Battlemaid Yavil. Those names are very clunky, and I will say that when reading this book, one of the things that took me a little while to kind of get into was how clunky I felt a lot of the dialogue was. And I don't mean like it was bad dialogue. I just mean it was very like high fantasy dialogue. It wasn't the way you would think. It's not really the way normal people would talk to each other. And it's also very much not the way gamers would talk to each other. If you've ever sat around a table at, playing any sort of tabletop game, it's really not like Critical Role, at least in my experience, where people are doing a lot of voices and talking like they just came out of like 14th century England. Now, everyone's experience is different, and I'm sure there are a lot of games that are like that. It just isn't my experience, so that was a little stilting when I was trying to read it and get into it. But like I said, this is also first edition, so everyone's roles are very rigid. And it also kind of felt like they were maybe high level. I'm not super familiar with the first edition rule set. I was a kid who came up playing on the second edition, not because that's what was out when I was a kid, but just because of the fact that that's what was cheap, and that's what people would let us play because they weren't as expensive as the 3.5 rule books, because at one point you could pick up second edition stuff literally everywhere. So I'm much more familiar with THACO scores than I am having to roll to be able to be certain characters, or even some of the names of the classes and stuff were just very unfamiliar to me. Like the fact that the lizard men in this, one of the characters is a lizard man. He has to like be submerged in water every now and again. So there's a part where they're crossing a desert, and yeah, it obviously becomes a problem. And I think he gets sick at one point, and they have to like do some stuff to help him. My biggest issue with this book, let me try to phrase this. I don't know if you've ever come across different types of fantasy, or if you're a fantasy writer yourself, but if you go to like look at story submissions a lot of times, or even novel submissions, when publishers are open for submissions, one of the things they will say is that they don't want stories that read like play-by-play Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. And as someone that, when I think of Dungeons and Dragons books, I think more of like R.E. Salvatore or Doug Niles. I'm thinking of basically just fantasy books that take place in the Dungeons and Dragons universe and aren't really play-by-play games. So I never really understood why someone would put that in there. I didn't understand why it would be a bad thing. I understand now, because this book very much is kind of a play-by-play of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Now, Andre Norton is a super talented writer, so she does this well, but I could very much understand someone who's not a super talented writer or just beginning their writing career. It would come off very clunky, because even there were parts, where I was like, I'm just going to put this book down for a while because it's just too much. Because they do travel a lot. They go through a lot of different terrains, and it's basically kind of tying together a bunch of mini adventures to make an overall adventure in the way that a Dungeons and Dragons campaign is, right? A Dungeons and Dragons campaign is essentially just a lot of traveling. It's an extended vacation for a bunch of murder hobos to go and try to save the world, especially longer campaigns, right? And that's kind of how this plays out. Obviously, they're also looking for a wizard that'll be able to put them back in their real bodies, because as the book goes on, they start to realize that, you know, they're basically two people in one body. Now, that being said, they still don't ever revert to like more modern dialogue or anything like that. So we don't get like any breakthroughs of their other personalities, so to speak. That being said, I did really like this book. It also, I think, as someone who didn't grow up playing first edition, gave me an idea of what people looked for in first edition campaigns, and also kind of how they wish they would play through, if that makes sense. So that was kind of interesting to read. It's definitely a little piece of Dungeons and Dragons history, and it's also, I think, a really well-written fantasy book. It's not very sword and sorcery. There's not like a whole bunch of action. It's more of fantasy, I think, in the way that a team learns to work together, and each chapter where there is combat, one team member kind of ends up being the hero in that chapter as we learn what their abilities are. And that would make sense, because this also, I'm sure, got a lot of people into the game because they probably wanted to be, you know, make characters like Nail Longtooth, the Berserker, or I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but the Battle Maiden, or the Swordsman, or the Lizard Man. Especially in a time period where there probably wasn't a lot of content, because I do believe this book came out, I mean, this was put out by Dahl, so this was probably before, you know, TSR was pumping out its own fiction line. So that's kind of interesting. I did enjoy this book. I'm going to try to track down the sequel. If you like lit RPGs or game lit or even isekai, which I'm not the person to talk about anime or manga, I'm just not that into it. I definitely watched it and paid more attention to it when I was younger, but now that I'm older, there's just so much of it, and I just literally don't have the time. That's it. So it's not me saying I don't like it, it's just me knowing I don't have the time to watch some of these things that have like 400 episodes. Now, that being said, I will watch Cowboy Bebop and Gundam or Samurai Champloo whenever, but those aren't super long series, and I can usually get through those. But that has nothing to do with this book. I'm sorry for going off on a tangent. I like this book. If you find a copy, I think you should give it a try. I got my copy for 50 cents. I do believe the copy I'm gonna link on Amazon in the show notes actually has the first and second book in an omnibus edition. So that is kind of cool. And highly recommend, you know, if you're not looking for the classic Dahl book and you don't like want to collect this cover or whatever, just to get that book. Like, I don't think they sell the sequel by itself. I could be completely wrong about that, but either way, there is a omnibus edition. I'll link that in the show notes. I like this book. It was kind of clunky at times. It's a very well written rendition of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. If you're thinking it's gonna be like R.A. Salvatore or something, where it's just set in the world of Greyhawk and it's from, you know, it's playing that out, you're going to be disappointed, so don't go into it with that mindset. This is very much just like a play-by-play of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign from the point of view of various characters. So if that sounds like something you're into, you're going to have a good time. This is also a first edition, and probably very early first edition at that, so there are going to be some things that probably aren't going to jive if you're like me and you came into Dungeons and Dragons through later editions. But either way, this was an enjoyable book. I do recommend everyone to go read it. So yeah, if you've read it, didn't read it, you read the sequel, please let me know in the show notes. I mean, in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.